I got the right thing.
Long time no see.
What's on there? Just to preserve as much as you can. The neighborhood. Here, evaluate criteria too. So I just, there are 5 scenarios.
No. Wait, no? These seats aren't. Sit on this side. That way I can have.
Just not too excited. I understand nothing about it. It's a step up to that.
So, can everybody hear? Or do I need the microphone? So I'm gonna call the meeting to order. We do have a quorum. What my hope is, Pat Gallagher from Slam is gonna do the presentation today. What I'd like to have happen is that the committee will take a week to digest the information we get, and at that point, we'll call a special meeting, make our recommendations to the board. At that point, the board will schedule 2 public forums, time and location to be determined. At that point, the public will be allowed to ask questions, be a part of the process, and then it'll go over to the full board for a vote from there. But we wanted to make sure that we had the community's input on this, make sure they understood what was happening and how things were gonna take place, so that's kind of where I was hoping things would go. I look for, from the committee members, I look for an acceptance of the minutes from the March 7, 2024 regular meeting. Moved by, you're not, oh yeah, you are a regular meeting, though, yeah. So, motion by Mr. O'Brien, second by Mr. Llewellyn, any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? Motion passed unanimously. All right, so we're, they,
Hold on, I just wanna make sure we can hear them. Pat, can you say a few words so I can see if I hear you?
You all hear me okay?
Thank you.
okay, so we're gonna start the presentation. Some of the committee will be able to ask questions. If you guys have questions, write them down, either forward them to a committee member. If time permits, maybe we can get some questions going, but, this is more of a committee meeting than a public forum, but, we'll try to, if the opportunity presents itself, we'll allow the public to ask some questions. Thanks.
Hey there, everybody. Pat Gallagher with the Slam Collaborative. Got a lot of ground to cover tonight, but happy to pause when we're at stopping points in the presentation, and that way kind of answering some questions as we go along. I wanted to start tonight with just a recap of our work to date. So to date, we've done our capacity and utilization study, and the findings of that are really driving the redistricting scenarios that we'll study. Some of the key findings of the first phase of our process, that we're projecting your elementary school enrollment to decrease slightly over the next decade. I think the biggest challenge that you all are facing is we have an uneven distribution of headroom and space across your elementary. We have Chapel, which is quite underutilized. It has an undersized attendance zone, and the building is not very well utilized relative to its size. And similarly, Johnson House, on the other end of the spectrum, is too large for, the attendance zone is too large for the school's capacity. And as a result, there's a significant number of students who live in that attendance zone who are placed in other schools. And so that creates some uncertainties around families, especially in the Johnson House attendance zone, and that they may only be able to attend their neighborhood school in space available. And then other challenges related to Lordship. So Lordship is also an underutilized school, and the size of Lordship is really one of its constraining factors. It's too small to function as a true 2-section per grade neighborhood school. You need 14 classrooms to have 2 sections in every grade. Right now, we have 2 classrooms at Lordship that are the ADA program. And even if that program were relocated, we would still be short of space due to the need for some full-size classrooms for art and music and various special education and support functions under that neighborhood school model. At the elementary and middle schools, we're projecting an enrollment decline at both the middle and at the middle and high school level. We're projecting declines with about 6% decrease at the middle school and about a 12% decrease at the high school level. And that's largely driven by some smaller classes that you currently have in your elementary grades, moving up and replacing larger graduating classes. Middle school, we're projecting utilization at about 70% overall over the next decade, with booster being more highly utilized than blood. We did do a test in our initial phase of our work to see, is there enough space at the middle school to move 6th grade up? And one of our findings was that you just simply don't have enough classroom space because we cannot put 6th graders in available seats within 7th and 8th grade classes. And so our work was really focused on looking at classrooms. And so there's a shortage of space that makes that not feasible in the current building setup. Although that could certainly be something that could be studied further with some space additions or other changes, maybe a longer term option to explore. Another challenge is an imbalanced feeder pattern. So the feeder pattern being the elementary schools that move up to certain middle schools and middle schools that move up to certain high schools. Ideally, when you have 2 middle schools and 2 high schools, it's ideal to have close to a 50-50 split where enrollment is about equal between the buildings. But what we find is that right now, Worcester and Stratford High School are larger than the Flood Middle School and DeMille High School feeder patterns. So we have about a 55-45 split, and that results in larger enrollment at Worcester Middle School and Stratford High School. And especially at the high school level, where enrollment in the Stratford High School attendance zone is starting to creep up near the design enrollment, that's resulted in some administrative placements with students being sent to the middle. And so as we propose some changes to the elementary attendance zones, the presentation this evening, that will then impact the middle and high school attendance zones as well. So we'll be taking a look at all of your buildings and all of your grade configurations, because whatever changes you make at elementary will then feed into the middle and the high school. So over the last several months, we've worked with the committee to establish our guiding criteria and our charge. So really laying out what are we trying to accomplish as part of the redistricting process. So our primary objective is to strive for an enrollment balance between facilities. So at the elementary level, that's making sure that we have headroom in all of our buildings and making sure that we don't have buildings that are both overutilized and underutilized. And at the middle and high school level, striving for a more balance between your middle and high school buildings, aspiring to get a 50-50 split. A secondary objective is to improve racial balance and maintain compliance with state law. The criteria being to strive to remove the impending balance designations. So other considerations that we've noted over the last several months is that the short-term focus is on the existing grade configuration. We are presenting one option tonight that looks at an alternative approach to 6th grade. And as I mentioned, the 6 through 8 middle school could be something studied, and that's a longer-term option. But ultimately, the short-term focus and things that could be implemented quickly are largely focused on the existing grade configuration. We are trying to maintain the neighborhood school model to the greatest extent we can, also being sensitive to disruption and the number of students that we have to move. So that's become one of the criteria that are metrics that we're looking at. We want to try to reduce administrative placements. Obviously, for programs like the dual language program that functions as a magnet program or a choice program, and students will be attending a school outside of their zone school if they're in the dual language program, but we want to try to reduce other administrative placements and where necessary, such as in wardship, better define policies and perhaps geographies so that when we are doing administrative placements, there is a little more structure to it. And as I mentioned, wardship being kind of the exception where given its size under a neighborhood school model, the scenarios that we're presenting tonight that maintain the neighborhood model do have some level of administrative placement in that building due to its size. And so we're using a tool that we're calling Flex Zone. So it's essentially an area that has one of 2 buildings that students who reside in that Flex Zone could attend, and that would be based on available space. So the approaches that we are looking at tonight are traditional redistricting. So this is trying to maintain contiguous attendance zones. So we have 2 takes on that. One strives for the best enrollment balance between the buildings. And the second tries to achieve the greatest racial balance. Another approach is satellite zoning. So that means that we have some non-contiguous areas that may be sent elsewhere. Satellite zoning is often a tool that's used to minimize the number of students moved. So you're moving students from a school that maybe is overutilized to a school that's underutilized without necessarily having contiguous geography. We're looking at a 6th grade academy option, Chapel, and then finally looking at converting lordship to a dual language school. So before we get into the scenarios, we wanted to spend a little bit of time explaining the state's racial balance law, especially since that is one of our criteria that we're striving to achieve. So the state statutes have 4 categories, 4 racial balance categories, and all of these are based on district-wide share of students of color compared to individual building students of color percentages. So racially balanced building is when a school is within plus or minus 15% of the district average number of students of color. And obviously no action is required under state law. The next category is what we call impending imbalance. And historically, Stratford has had a few schools in this impending imbalance category. That's when a school is between 15 and 25% higher or lower than the district-wide average for late grades. This is still compliant with state law, but you will put on notice, and the state basically tells you that you, while you're compliant, you may be approaching non-compliance. So you're not required to have corrective action, but oftentimes districts strive to reduce impending imbalance simply because it could lead to an imbalance in the future. The racial imbalance category is when a school deviates by the district-wide percentage of students of color by more than 25%. So 25% higher or 25% lower. And so under this situation, the state will notify you, and you have to develop a corrective action plan. So you are non-compliant with the state statute if you were in this racial imbalance category. And there's a fourth category, and that's called diverse school status. And this applies to districts that have a student of color population of 50% or more. That applies to Stratford. And when that's the case, that any school that has between 25 and 75% students of color is considered compliant with the state racial balance law, and no action is necessary. And so several of your schools fall into that diverse school status category. So taking a look at what this means for Stratford, this shows our racial balance criteria and how that is applied to Stratford. We're using your 2023, October 2023 enrollment here. This is unofficial data. The state, I believe, releases their annual racial balance reports in May. But as a district, your elementary grades, so K-6, has nearly 75% students of color, so just 74.6%. And so this chart on the left here shows the ranges for the different racial balance categories. So any school that's between 75 and 89.6% students of color is in the racially balanced category. Any school between 89.7 and 99.6% students of color is in the impending category, so not compliant, but approaching non-compliance. Racial imbalance is any school that is less than 25% or greater than 99.6% students of color. And then again, Stratford has diverse school status. And so any school between 25 and 75% students of color is considered a diverse school and also compliant with the state racial balance law. And based on our experience working with other districts and your large number of students of color, we feel that it is highly unlikely that Stratford will ever have a school in this racial imbalance category that is non-compliant, simply because of your neighborhood demographics. So it's very unlikely that a school will be 99.6% students of color, and we also feel that it is very unlikely that any school will be less than 25% students of color. So as we went through our planning scenarios, we developed some criteria that we're going to use to weigh them relative to one another and also relative to the status quo. And so we'll be looking at enrollment balance, so that is our utilization, making sure no buildings are overutilized, and also striving to have buildings close to the district-wide average. As I mentioned before, we're striving for a balanced middle school feeder. We have a good median performance metric for that. Racial balance, a good category is removing the impending designations out of all schools within 15%, even those in the diverse school status. Fair means all schools are compliant, but we may have at least one school that deviates by more than 15% from the district-wide average. And then obviously poor, we don't want any schools that are not compliant with the state racial balance law. You want to be sensitive to disruption. So for each scenario, we're identifying the number of students who would be moved hypothetically should that be implemented. And then we have two metrics that look at kind of neighborhood-based models, so looking at geographic proximity, which is somewhat of a qualitative method. You know, are we aligning with this neighborhood school model? Are we making it better? Are we making it worse? We did coordinate with your transportation provider to get a high-level opinion on whether scenarios will need fewer buses, about the same number of buses, or additional buses. We still have to screen scenario 5 with them, but we had that for the other scenarios. Then finally, whether we can reduce or eliminate out-of-area placements. So our assumptions for all of these scenarios are that all out-of-area placements except dual language students, district-wide special ed students, ABA program, etc., are returned to their zone school, except for Lordship, where we established what we were calling a flex zone, and I can explain that when I read this in the map pages. So today, about 18% of your elementary students attend a school other than their zone school. So about half of those attend the dual language program. We anticipate that will continue. We have about 87 students who attend Lordship who actually live within the Johnson House attendance zone. And then we have over 200 other out-of-area placements, and these students mostly reside in either Franklin, Johnson House, or Nichols, but attend another school. And this does add some uncertainty to our projections and scenario planning because it is a decently large number of students, and so it's predicated on these assumptions holding true. As I mentioned, any students in district-wide special programs, we left those buildings in their, or we left those programs in their current buildings unless noted otherwise. And so in the instances where we did shift programs to different buildings, we did consult with their administrators just to make sure that the location was appropriate. And then when we did shift programs, that did change the capacity of individual buildings, and so we'll know when that happens. Any questions before we get into this scenario?
Any committee members have any questions? So, I just have one. You had made a comment about policies. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Let's see. So you had said reduce administrative placement and better define policies. What, did you have specific policies in mind, or?
Sure. So the flex zone would be, I think, a good example of that. So right now, for example, students who attend Lordship who live in Johnson House, they're kind of scattered across the Johnson House attendance zone. And so when a family moves to Johnson House, regardless of where they live, they may or may not be sent to Lordship. So better defining that would essentially be kind of carving off an area of Johnson House and saying students who live within this, what we're calling flex zone, may attend Johnson House if space is available, or they may be placed in Lordship if space is available. So it better defines the policy compared to today, where it's done, I think, much more on a case-by-case basis.
And as far as, so you had talked about the racial balance, diverse, you said, I think, Stratford was in a diverse school status?
Correct.
And is that entire district, or do you look at that as at a per school basis, or how do you come to that conclusion?
A district has to qualify for diverse school status based on overall student demographics, which Stratford, it meets that criteria. And then diverse school status will be applied to individual schools if they have between 25% and 75% students of color. So today you have several schools that are in that range, and you have some schools that are above that range that are either balanced or independent.
And do you identify those schools in there?
So we identify them for all the scenarios. So essentially what we did is we reran the racial balance numbers under any of the scenarios, and we'll show whether it's a diverse school or whether it's in the independent category or whether it's racially balanced.
And that's later on in the presentation?
That's correct. And I believe in 2022, the racial balance report from the state, you had 2 schools in the impending category, Franklin and Johnson House. And then Wilcoxon exceeded or was below the district-wide percentage of students of color by more than 15%, but it was considered a diverse school, so it wasn't in the impending balance list.
Thank you. Anybody else? Nope, no more questions. Move on.
All right, excellent. So the first scenario that we're going to look at is traditional redistricting. So this is looking at kind of preserving the neighborhood model to the greatest extent we can and making some small changes to better balance utilization across the buildings, maintaining compliance with the state racial balance law, of course, returning students to their own schools. And then we established a secondary flex zone to ensure efficient use of racial balance at Lordship. I should mention as well that Lordship relies on administrative placements for racial balance. So this is the hypothetical or conceptual map for for scenario 1. So we have enlarged the chapel attendance zone, and on the next slide I will show which areas have been added into chapel. We have also shrunk the Johnson House attendance zone, and then we have established this flex zone here, where students would attend either Lordship or Johnson House based on available space, and that would then remove all the other administrative placements to attend Lordship and the rest of Johnson House. And so our projections are assuming about 105 students from this flex zone are administratively placed into Lordship. So today you have about 90, so that would be slightly more, and that's just to get a more efficient use of Lordship, knowing that Johnson House is one of your more well-used schools. This map shows which areas would be reassigned. The color, underlying color, shows the school that they would attend under this conceptual map. Overall, this would impact about just under 400 students. About half of those are students who live within a redistricted area. And, just under half are out-of-area placements who would be returned to their zone of school. And so you can see kind of in these areas that aren't moved, we still have some dots where predominantly Johnson House and Franklin, which are out-of-area placements. So as I mentioned before, we are enlarging chapel, so we are sending a portion of Wilcox into chapel. We're also sending areas of Eli Whitney and Second Hill into chapel as well. And so shipping students out of Wilcoxon opens up some space in Wilcoxon to then shift some of the Johnson House attendance zone to Wilcoxon. So it ends up being about an even split. So Wilcoxon sends about 70 students to chapel, receives just under 70 students from Johnson House. And then we have some smaller pocket areas that we will have better utilization balance at Nichols and Eli. So this table takes a look at utilization over the next 10 years. What we've done is we've aggregated it over 5-year increments. So the first 5-year average is really what we're looking at as our target, because we have the greatest confidence in the first 5 years. But as you can see, all schools would be under 95% utilization, so we're not having any schools that are approaching overcrowded. And all schools are within about 6% of the district-wide average, so ranging from 93% at Chapel and Franklin to a low of 82% at Wilcoxon and Johnson House. This shows the racial balance under this scenario. So we would have essentially no change from today. So last year we had 2 schools in the impending category and 1 school in the diverse school category that exceeded 15% of the district-wide average for students of color. Franklin and Johnson House would both be in that category as well, and Wilcoxon would be a diverse school. One important trend that we picked up on is that for both Franklin and Johnson House, the deviation from the district-wide average is shrinking. It has shrunk quite a bit over the last few years. So as the district-wide share of students of color increases, the share at those schools is not increasing at as great of a rate. And so they're becoming closer to the district-wide average over time. So under scenario 1, Franklin would be about 16% higher than the district-wide average, and Johnson House would be about 17% higher than the district-wide average. So just outside of that balanced category, but still. We applied this same elementary attendance zones to the middle schools. So one of the rationales of moving this area to Wilcoxon is that it allows us to shift some additional students into Flood, which is the larger of the 2 middle school buildings. We did not achieve that when it shifted students from Second Hill and Eli Whitney to Flood to Chapel, because all 3 of those schools are currently in Flood Middle School. So overall, we're shifting about just under 40 7th grade students, and a lot of those are out-of-area placements or administrative placements that will be returned to their zone school. So this would improve enrollment balance. So we would be at about a 53-47 split, with Booster remaining the larger of the two middle schools, but we're not quite at 50-50. And similarly, we applied the same logic to the high schools, where we would impact just over 150 students, and This is largely due to administrative placement since we have a significant number of students who live in the Stratford high attendance zone who get sent to Benel. And so we would also be shifting about 43 students into Benel in a smaller area from Benel to Stratford High School. So this would also result in about a 53-47 split compared to today where you're at, I believe it's closer to a 55-45 split. So this is just our scorecard that will show for all the scenarios that goes through and summarizes the scenario relative to our metrics. So this performs well on the enrollment balance side with all schools below 95% and all schools also within about 6% of the district-wide average. So we don't have those highs and lows that we have today. We improve balance at the middle and high school level, but not quite to that 50-50 split that we are aspiring to. From a racial balance standpoint, this would be a scenario that's compliant, but we would still have 2 schools in the impending category and another diverse school that exceeds 15% of the district-wide average. So no change compared to status quo. And then we would have the greatest impact at the elementary level with the about 12% of students we districted, and then lesser impacts at the middle and high school level. This does align with the neighborhood-based model, and so your transportation provider did note that this was the most efficient scenario that we prepared, that they looked at from a transportation standpoint, and would likely result in the need for buses. And while we are reducing administrative placements, we still need to maintain a policy of lordship via the flex zone in order to make sure we are efficiently using that space. Scenario 2 is an alternative approach. We're also using traditional redistricting. Well, this scenario is really looking at, can we remove the impending designation at all of your elementary schools? And as we noted in our presentation a few months ago, when we look at the neighborhood demographics in Stratford, there's a lot of variability where you have certain neighborhoods with a very, very high percentage of students of color, other neighborhoods with much lower percentages of students of color. And so that ended up being, a real challenge of trying to have some logic and proximity while also having racial balance. And this has no changes to special programs, and like scenario 1 has a flex zone for lordship, so the identical policy as scenario 1. So this map, like scenario 1, enlarges the chapel attendance zone and shrinks the Johnson House attendance zone. Then we have a lot of odd areas that we moved simply to achieve that true racial balance of all of the schools. So we had to grab neighborhoods, including some of those right next to Franklin School that had Johnson House, send those to Wilcoxon. We had to grab areas of Wilcoxon on the east side of Main Street, all the way up to the chapel attendance zone, and sending that to Johnson House, and then making some shifts between Franklin and Nichols to balance, racially balance the student population there as well. So you'll notice we have a lot more areas moved and a lot more students impacted than we did under scenario 1. So under scenario 2, we're impacting about 550 students, 400 of those through redistricting, 150 through administrative. And the flex zone showing for lordship is the same as this scenario also does a good job of balancing utilization between the buildings. So we are ranging from 91% at Chapel and Wilcoxon to a low of 79% at Johnson House. So we are achieving that enrollment balance across all buildings, having some headroom. As I mentioned, this scenario, if it were in place for the 23-24 school year, would have all schools in either the diverse school category or racially balanced category, and all schools would be within 15% of the district-wide average. However, historically, when we did a 5-year look back Franklin for 3 of the 5 years, or for 2 of the 5 years would have been in the impending category and have brought the average up into that category. So we are balanced at Franklin, but just barely. Similarly, we have additional areas that are moved in scenario 2 compared to scenario 1, where we're shifting students from Worcester to Flood, also shifting some students from Flood to Worcester. Like scenario 1, this would result in about a 53-47 split between the middle schools, with Worcester remaining the larger of the 2 buildings. So some improvement, but not quite good. And similarly, at the high school level, impacting a greater number of students compared to scenario 1, we are shifting slightly more students into Bunnell, but we are shifting areas both from Stratford to Bunnell and from Bunnell to Stratford. Ends up being a small net gain in Bunnell. And again, a 53-47 split like the middle school, with Stratford High remaining the larger of the 2 buildings. So this one, I think, demonstrates one of the trade-offs that we'll be dealing with as part of the redistricting process, where we're really balancing or looking at some of the pros and cons of these scenarios. So the pro of this scenario is that it achieves true racial balance between your elementary schools, but that comes at the expense of both redistricting impacts with a greater number of students moved, and a deviation from that neighborhood-based model, especially in the more dense neighborhoods of Stratford, Franklin, Nichols, Johnson House, where we are splitting those areas between multiple buildings. The transportation provider did note that this would require additional buses because we are moving some areas that they currently walk to their school. And like scenario 1, we need to maintain that flex zone language. Scenario 3 looks at a non-contiguous attendance zone. So this is usually an approach that's used to try to minimize redistricting impacts. And I believe this was the scenario that moved the fewest number of students out of the 5 that we were looking at tonight. And so again, we're striving for enrollment and racial balance between buildings, no changes to district-wide special programs or language programs, and like scenarios 1 and 2, we are showing that flex zone for lower change. So here we are again enlarging Chapel and shrinking Johnson House. We do have a satellite zone here that we are creating. We are sending an area of Johnson House up to Chapel. That's to reduce some of the redistricting impacts by shifting areas from schools that have some space concerns to schools that don't, without necessarily having to go through another school and make kind of a secondary shift. But again, that deviates from that traditional neighborhood-based model. And then we had some other smaller moves to other attendance zones to better balance. So we're shifting part of Wilcoxon to Chapel, also shifting that Johnson House satellite zone to Chapel. We're shifting a smaller area of Johnson House into Wilcoxon, and then a small area of Franklin into Johnson House to try to free up a little bit of extra space at Franklin, just because it is such a small building. So this would impact just under 350 students, the majority of those being out of area placements returned to their own school. So like the other scenarios that we've looked at thus far, this does a good job of balancing enrollment between the buildings, ranging from a high of about 92% at Second Hill Lane to a low 80% at Wilcoxon. So we have that headroom spread across each of the buildings. Scenario 3 is compliant with the state racial balance law. For 23-24, we would have 1 school in the impending category, again Franklin, and then Wilcoxon would be a diverse school, but would exceed, or would be greater than 15% below the district-wide percentage of students in college. Like scenario 1 and scenario 2, the gap between Franklin and the district-wide average is shrinking. For scenario 3, it would be about 17% of the school year, which is down quite a bit from about 5 years ago. So we have a close closer to that balanced category. Changes here are and quite similar to those in scenario one, where we're shifting students from Middle which then results in a shift from Booster to Flood, and then two smaller areas shift down near the Franklin attendance zone. This would achieve closer to a 50-50 split, a 52-48 split. Booster again grew larger over two buildings, but we're getting closer to that 50-50 split than we are. And then at the high school level, impacting about 165 students. Again, most of those are out-of-area placements, and we are about at a 53-47 split, with Stratford High being the larger of the two high schools, but we are seeing a net gain at Bunnell over status quo. So scenario three, like the first two scenarios, we looked at this score well in the enrollment balance category. Like scenario one, it was compliant with the racial balance law, but we still have one school pending, another school that's the first school but exceeding 15%. So we're in that fair category. This moves with the fewest number of students, so slightly less than scenario one. Again, one of the trade-offs here is that the satellite zone, again, is a deviation from that neighborhood model. And actually, this should be this actually may result in the need for fewer buses just because of some of the other areas we're moving, and the reducing administrative placements may result in this as well. And then again, like scenario one, scenario two, needing to maintain that administrative policy at Lordship. So scenario four is a different take than some of the ones that we've looked at. So this looks at converting Chapel to a sixth grade academy, and so all the remaining buildings would be converted to a K-5 school. There are a couple of things that led us to end on Chapel. One is the size of the building. It's optimally sized for a sixth grade cohort, so it wouldn't be, it's big enough, but it's not so big that we are losing precious space at the elementary level, since we know the elementary level is at a district-wide level well utilized. There's also relatively few students in Chapel, so this ends up reducing the redistricting impacts versus if we were to select another one of your larger schools that's in a much more dense area. And then we converted the remaining buildings to a K-5 configuration, and so we made some adjustments to the attendance zones to balance out the remaining schools, as well as accommodate any K-5 students who live in the Chapel attendance zone. One of the other benefits of this scenario is that by moving to a K-5 model, Lordship can be converted to a two-section per grade neighborhood school. We don't need 12 classrooms at Lordship under K-5 model, so that is workable, and so we actually are able to eliminate the flex zone here, so Lordship will have a true attendance zone. And then we do have to shift some programs out of Lordship, the ABA classrooms, in order to make that work. And then like the other scenarios, those changes have then been moved to the middle and high school level, although in this case, we did have to make a change to the feeder pattern to high school. So in terms of program shifts, we shifted the CGB classrooms out of Lordship to Nichols. So that frees up 2 classrooms that we need to make Lordship a true two-section per grade school. So you'll note that Lordship's capacity will be higher, Nichols' capacity will be lower than what we have presented for our existing conditions. We also have 3 district-wide programs currently at Chapel, so we moved those 3 classrooms to Wilcoxon. And then shifting all the 6th grade students to Chapel means that we have to reserve some space at Chapel for district-wide special programs in those grades, as well as make sure that we have enough space for all of the support services and specials that we need. And so So the planning capacity at Chapel, again, is going to look different than it did under our existing conditions because we're using different classrooms for instruction, and then we're also using a higher loading level, which is based on your policy for sixth grade rather than an average for K-6. So our capacity at Chapel is increased to just under 530 students. So we reassigned the Chapel attendance zone, splitting it between Second Mill Lane, which is the blue, and Eli Whitney in the purple, and the satellite zone that goes to Chapel was shifted to Johnson House. We have a attendance zone for Lordship, and that we don't have a need for a flex zone anymore under this scenario. And then we made some minor changes to the other schools to make that work. So as I noted, Chapel split between Second Hill Lane and Eli Whitney. We have an area shifted from Johnson House to Lordship, and then two smaller moves into Johnson House, one from Wilcoxon, because Wilcoxon loses 3 classrooms due to the STEPS program, and then the satellites, the Chapel satellite zone also gets up to Johnson. So this would, again, create some headroom in all of your buildings, under 95% of all buildings, with a little bit greater range here, a high of 94% at Second Hill Lane and a low of 75% at Wilcoxon. So that could potentially be space reserved if you have future special programs that you'd like to add to an individual building. But all schools have some headroom, which is our primary goal. And as I noted, Chapel is really ideally sized for a 6th grade cohort. I believe they're about 450 to 500 students historically and projected, and so we're at about 92% utilization. And obviously, having all the 6th graders there, we don't have the same concerns that we do in a K-5 school, where you may have students in multiple grades and some pinch points. In the racial balance category, we moved Chapel because it would be reflecting the district-wide average for both grades. Like some of the other scenarios that we looked at, Franklin would remain in the impending category, just above 15%, and Wilcoxon would remain a diverse school, but again, it would be would exceed the district-wide average students of color by more than 50%. So 6th grade would all attend Chapel. I think one of the considerations here is that it would be the only time when all of your students would come together. So students would come together for 1 year, and then they would be again split for the middle school and for the high school. So that's certainly a consideration. This is certainly going to be a little bit more of a challenge from a transportation standpoint, busing all of the students up to Chapel. So the transportation provider noted this would require additional buses, and may also impact bell times, just due to the need to have a number of buses drive 6th graders to Chapel simultaneously. So you may not be able to have the same bell time as the elementary school, just given the sheer number of buses. And then obviously the location of Chapel, the northern part of town, would result in some longer travel times for those in the south of town. This would also require a modification to the feeder pattern. So Flood, as we know, is the smaller of the 2 middle schools, and Chapel is one of the schools that feeds into Flood Middle School. And so in order to balance this out, we ended up shifting or switching Nichols and Franklin, with Nichols being a larger school. We'll move that into the Flood feeder, and Franklin being a smaller school, moved into the Worcester feeder. So this results in greater impacts at the middle school level, so about 150 students, including a loss of some students. Ironically, actually, Worcester is located in the flood attendance zone, but many of their walkers live just in this neighborhood, just to the south. That neighborhood would all be shifted to Flood, the Nichols neighborhood, and so that would be a loss of walkers at Worcester. So again, greater transportation costs this would achieve about a 52-48 split. So similar to what we've seen for the other scenarios where we're improving over the status quo, but not quite getting to 50-50 split. And then we also looked at racial balance for this scenario, and we are worsening the racial balance compared to today, where both schools are quite close to the district-wide average. This would increase it, although both schools would still be within plus or minus 10% of the district-wide average student. And similarly, those same changes were made to the high school attendance zones. Again, greater redistricting impacts at the high school level, about 550 students. We are shifting more students into the middle, and getting close to that 50-50 split at about 51-49%. And like the middle schools, racial balance is worsened compared to status quo, but both schools would be within plus or minus 10% of the district-wide average. So scenario 4, obviously like all the others, has some pros and some cons. We're able to achieve enrollment balance with some greater range between the elementary schools. We are able to balance the middle and high school feeder. I believe this performed the best out of all the scenarios we looked at, but it does require a change to the feeder pattern and a greater level of disruption at the middle and high school level. We are compliant with the state racial balance law, but still have 2 schools, one in the impending category and one in the diverse school category, that deviate by more than 15%. This scenario has greater redistricting impacts than the scenario we've looked at thus far. So over 20% of elementary students, just under 15% of middle school students, and 20% of high school students would be impacted in this scenario. So certainly a lot of disruption. And then this would require additional buses, so greater transportation costs and possible impacts to bell times due to the location of Chapel and the need for buses. And then administrative placements would be eliminated by converting Lordship to a K-5 neighborhood school. And then scenario 5 is another greater change from status quo that we looked at, and that is converting Lordship to a dual language magnet school. So it would no longer be a neighborhood-based school. So we shift that program from Second Hill Lane to Lordship, and Lordship becomes a 2-section per grade dual language school, and then making obviously changes to the other buildings to account for that program shift and also balance enrollment across buildings. So, as I noted, we shift program from Second Hill Lane to Lordship, and that increases Lordship's capacity to 280 seats, so we are loading 14 classrooms at 20 students. And one of the reasons why we feel like this works better than under the neighborhood model is that the need for some of those special education support services is likely going to be less at a dual language school than it would be for a neighborhood school. And so we would have one full-size room being reserved for art and music, and then should this move forward for greater consideration, all the other support services will need to be located in shared spaces. So the building does have several small spaces, small breakout rooms, etc. And so those various services will need to cycle through there on a scheduled basis. And then we are shifting 2 ABA classrooms at Lordship, and then moving into the second. So this eliminates the Lordship attendance zone altogether, and that area is shifted into Johnson House. And then we're also opening up a significant amount of space at Second Hill Lane. And so we are shifting a significant number of students into Second Hill Lane as well. Like some of the other scenarios that we're looking at, we are shifting students from, we're enlarging the Chapel attendance zone and shifting students from Wilcoxon to Chapel, and then making a move from Johnson House to Wilcoxon to help alleviate enrollment pressures at Johnson House. Lordship all moves to Johnson House, and then we're also shifting a pretty large area of Johnson House into Nichols, and then a large area of Nichols and a small area of Franklin would both move to Second Hill Lane. So this would like scenario 4, have a greater distributed impact than scenarios 1, 2, 3. Over 600 students would be impacted, and that would be over 460 for redistricting, additional for out-of-area placements, and then in addition, any student who do the language program, on top of the 600 plus students, would physically change buildings, moving from Second Hill Lane to Lordship, although they remain in the program with, staff and peers. So Lordship under this scenario would operate at 100% efficiency, and schools of choice can operate at 100% efficiency because you control enrollment through your lottery process. So we don't have concerns at that 100% utilization simply because you are able to control the number of students that enter the program. And so it creates a greater level of efficiency than a neighborhood-based school where we never try to get a school at 100%. And so we've made some changes to Lordship to reflect that magnet program. We've also made changes to Second Hill Lane as it shifts to a neighborhood-based school and also accommodates the ABA program. The remaining schools, we're looking at all the remaining schools at 90% utilization or less, with Franklin at the higher end at 90%, Second Hill Lane at about 74%. So again, it could be potentially an area where, should you expand district-wide programs, Second Hill Lane or Wilcoxon have some availability. And from a racial balance standpoint, again, this is very similar to what we've looked at for all of the scenarios except for scenario 2, where it's very difficult to get Franklin and Wilcoxon out of the pending and diverse school with greater than 15% deviation, simply because of the neighborhood demographics. Unless we deviate from the neighborhood model, both of those schools remain in that 15% more category, and the remaining schools will be compliant. At the middle school level, we are shifting students into flood, and this is a unique scenario in that flood would then become the larger of the two schools. So we are shifting more students into Second Hill Lane because this new language program leaves. And so that, moving that large number of students makes flood the larger of the two middle schools. And flood is a physically larger building, so it better aligns with the capacities here. And flood would be slightly more utilized than booster. Similarly, at the high school level, this would shift significantly more students into Bunnell than some of the other scenarios we looked at. And Bunnell would become the larger of the two high schools at about a 53-47. So again, difficult to hit that true 50-50 mark, although we certainly can make improvements for status quo. So again, takeaways here to summarize scenario 5. It does well from a utilization standpoint and allows us to efficiently use Lordship as a dual language only school. We improve the feeder pattern, but still not at 50-50, and it would make Flood and Bunnell the larger middle and high school facilities. Like all the other scenarios except for scenario 2, we would still add at least 2 buildings that exceed 15% of the district-wide average for students of color. We have greater redistricting impacts than most of the other scenarios we looked at 19% of elementary students, 6% of middle, and 9% of high school students. This would likely result in the need for additional buses, but again, we would want to verify this with the transportation provider should this be one of the scenarios that the board wishes to explore in greater detail. And then being able to eliminate administrative placements by converting Lordship to a Google Push. And then it's important to, in our minds, to compare all of the scenarios that we looked at relative to the status quo. So before we kind of do our scenario comparison and get into some of the Q&A, we took a look at the status quo and applied the same criteria and metrics. And so if we do nothing, we have some enrollment balance challenges with 2 schools projected to exceed 95% utilization over the next 5 years, while Chapel and Lordship are underutilized. And over years 6 through 10, we actually have some buildings exceeding 100% utilization. We have an imbalanced middle and high school feeder at about a 55-45 split. We have 2 schools in the impending category, and Wilcoxon has a diverse school that's less than 15% of the district-wide average student of color. Obviously, no redistricting impacts, no disruption, and no changes to geographic proximity or transportation, and then out-of-area placements would need to continue. So this just compares the various scenarios, again, red being poor, green being good, and the yellow color being fair. And, having done this exercise numerous times for districts, there's trade-offs, there's pros and cons with each scenario. There's never an option that is going to achieve everything you want to achieve, but there's going to be some give and take. So obviously some scenarios do better at enrollment balance than others. Scenario 2 does better at racial balance than others. There's a range of student disruption that needs to be considered. Obviously, neighborhood-based schools and transportation impacts need to be considered. And so we're hoping that this can kind of be a start of the discussion of which of these approaches may work best for staff. So just to kind of end with some of our key findings, regardless of which scenario presented, we are able to improve utilization and provide some headroom at all buildings. The range varies between scenarios, but we're at least able to provide some level of headroom. And then, any of these scenarios could be further refined. So tonight we're really focused on presenting 5 very different approaches to get the discussion started, knowing that, these could be fine-tuned. And in addition, district policies could also help further improve balance between buildings. So as I mentioned, it's difficult to achieve, to get all schools within 15% of your district-wide average students of color, but perhaps a combination of changes to attendance zones and a continuation of some of the policies that you've used in the past to maintain racial balance. Those could still be used as a combination. And then, I've mentioned we're able to improve balance at the middle and high school level, but it's difficult to achieve that true 50-50 split at the middle and high school level while maintaining balance at the elementary level. And then I just wanted to end on just a follow-up. I know the 6-8 middle school has been discussed as a potential longer-term option. And so I just wanted to lay out what we would recommend as next steps should this be a longer-term option that the district wants to explore in greater detail. Obviously, the 6-8 configuration won't work with the existing buildings, and so it really requires future study to determine what is required to make a 6-8 configuration work. So obviously, we would recommend evaluating the condition of the existing middle school buildings, looking at the existing sites and operations, looking at, is there areas of the site that could support additions? Are there areas where we could expand parking, circulation? Obviously, looking at our core spaces, if we were to add a grade, are the gym, cafeteria, media center, all those spaces large enough to support that larger student population? Would that need to be enlarged as well? Looking at the educational model for 6th grade. So right now, their 6th grade is homeroom. Other districts may use different educational models for 6th grade on their 6 through 8 configuration. So that may be studied in greater detail and may impact your spacing. And then ultimately understanding, what would you need to do to make the 6-8 configuration work? So it could look at a range of options, including, making space additions at your buildings, renovate, more ambitious projects like renovations, additions, or potentially new construction. And obviously, understanding costs associated with that is going to be really important, and a really important part of the decision-making process. Should this be something you want to explore in greater detail? So in terms of next steps, we've finished phase 1 and phase 2 of our work, and we are well underway in our redistricting planning. Obviously, a lot for you all to digest tonight. And so the next steps in this process is, once we've had a chance to kind of be absorbed, getting input on these scenarios from the committee or the board level, and then ultimately the board or committee identifying a preferred scenario or up to two. If there's still if there's not consensus on the best way forward. And then that would then go to a more detailed analysis or refinement process. Once there's been some identification of preferred scenarios, that's when we would recommend publishing an online map so that community members could see what the attendance zones would be under that scenario, and it could help understand the impacts to their students or families. We've found that that's been a very useful tool in other districts we've worked in. And then typically our recommended timeline is, should any changes to the attendance zones be made, it's typical that the adopted map and the adopted scenario is made about 10 to 12 months before it would go into effect. So usually the fall prior to going into effect, and that leaves you a little bit of time to incorporate anything into your budget that you may need for implementation, whether that be additional transportation, shifting programs, and stuff. So with that, I'm happy to go back to the scenario from here, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, I like the scenario 5. I think it's ridiculous. You'd be moving more kids than you have to. Back to scenario 1, where you have 12%, 3%, 7%. I think our objective is to try to not create havoc moving these kids. We try to move the minimal amount of people that you have to move. And as far as the 6th grade, I think you should leave them right where they are, because if you put them all in one school, you'd be busing all these kids all over this whole town to go to one school for 1 year, and then they're gonna go back to Split, and you could be going to Flood and Worcester. To me, that's asinine, planning to move the 6th grade for 1 year into one school, and especially if you put them in Chapel. 90% of these kids will be bused all the way over there. So I think this is my personal opinion, you should try to not move as many kids as you have to. Try to stay within the scenario 1 or scenario 3 is 3%, 7%, 11%, 12%. Try to move the least amount of kids. That's just my opinion.
Chris?
Pat, I'd just like to thank you for the depth of the information in your presentation, and also revealing that every single decision does have an impact. So I do appreciate that. It does look like this is very comprehensive. It allows us to make some good decisions here. I want to also understand that, okay, with scenario 3 in the satellite zone scenario, that allows us the opportunity to maintain the K through 6, and if so desired, perform the necessary feasibility study to go forward in the future. Is that correct?
So all of these scenarios maintain the K6 alignment except for scenario 4.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
And it still takes 10 months to a year, right? It's gonna take us all that. Correct?
So yeah, we would recommend,
So this program cannot be implemented next year, it has to be the year after.
Yeah, so typically you'd want to have some time to make sure that any costs are in the budget. So yes, if I were advising that, based on what most of my other clients have done, fall of 2025 would be kind of a target date.
Any other questions? So it's my understanding that we also contracted with you for 2 public forums. And so once we reduce it down to the 2, hopefully down to the 2, then the next process would be to conduct those public forums with you guys. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we have two board meetings that are in our contract, and yes, the idea would be that once the the committee kind of narrows the short list, that's probably the best time to gather public input, especially, you know, if some of these scenarios are non-starters for you all, it's better to eliminate those off the get-go rather than have families come out and say they hate, you know, a certain scenario, you know, that may not even align with your thinking anyway. So I think that's the right approach, yes.
Okay. So, and I mentioned it before, I think you joined in. What I like to do is give the committee a week to review this, schedule a special meeting on, depending on people's schedules, either on the 11th or possibly on the 8th, and try to narrow it down to the two, and then forward those two scenarios over to you guys, and schedule those public forums sometime after the April break. That'll work for you guys?
Yep.
I think, just in my opinion, I think there's a ton of information there, and you know, I think some of them are definitely non-starters, I would guess, only guessing, but for the majority of the board, but we have a couple of scenarios that are potential, but I like myself just to review that, and that's why I think having a special meeting on a week would be the correct route to take to give us some time to just really digest it. There's a lot of stuff here, and you went through it fairly quickly, but it's very, as Chris said, very inclusive, very thorough, and we do appreciate your willingness to look in other avenues, just to open up those possibilities and get our brains working. So I do appreciate that. So that scenario I laid out works for you guys. So maybe if you could send to Teresa some of your availability, and I'll send over some open dates for us as well, that we could conduct those public forums.
Sure.
It would be after the April break, so.
Right.
All right.
That's good.
Any other questions, comments from the committee? No? And at those public forums, typically people have an opportunity to ask questions and participate in the process. In a controlled environment, of course. Would that be correct?
Yeah, and we would also recommend, you know, if the committee can narrow it to two, we can also publish the online map viewers,
Okay.
and that should help with that dissemination of information as well.
Okay. So I'm gonna send out an email, or if everybody knows their schedule at this point, I'm leaning more towards a week from tonight, Thursday night. We can do a special meeting. If everybody reviews the information, it should be a fairly short. Maybe we get started like 5:30. Is 5 o'clock too early, or was 5:30 better?
Five's good for me.
Okay. So we'll plan on doing a special meeting then next Thursday at 5 o'clock, and at that point, we'll by hook or by crook, we'll get it narrowed down to 2, and send those to you.
Good.
All right, thank you. Appreciate your time.
Good night, everybody.
So then Teresa, if you could, in the meantime, just make sure that this PDF is put on the website, on the Board of Ed website, so if anybody doesn't have a copy, there are a few copies here, but if anybody wanted to get copies, you can pull them up on the board website, and that'll be in the morning, you'll be able to get those. So, there are a few copies, but they might be gone. They were, yeah. We printed about 20 of them. All right, so, moving along. As far as the capital improvement plan, I did speak with the mayor, they've been tied up in there. There's budget discussions, but I have some time scheduled with her next week. She wanted to just have a discussion before we voted on and sent our capital improvement plan over to the town. I don't know if Mr. Ruggiero, if there's any updates
approved Eli Whitney last night, they're gonna be done as single hung windows, so just the bottom will be operable. We did some coordination with the principal and with, he asked the staff to go in.
Yeah, Brian sent an update for Wilcox and to be on with.
Okay. But no, we approved Eli Whitney last night, and that'll go to the town council for Monday's meeting.
That's it? Okay, any new business, old business? So again, our next regularly scheduled meeting will be Thursday, May 2nd. We will have a special meeting at 5 o'clock, at least tonight. I'd ask all the members of the committee to spend some time to review the information you got this evening, and come with your best two choices. Again, as Pat said, it's preferable that we narrow it down to two, but if everybody came to their top two choices and be informed enough to speak to it, so we can have a discussion and hopefully unanimous for that. If not unanimous, majority vote forward to pass it in the process. That being said, take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.